Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the invite. And these invites are very precious to us, and no one opens their pulpit and opens their church and opens strange people to come and share with their congregation. We've been here sometimes before, and thank you so much for the friendship. I think it runs very, very long from Uncle LT's time. I was a student sitting in his class, listening to him teach about the Trinity and teach about so many things, and we are fruits of that. And thank you for prayers for India many, many years ago. Yes, it is indeed overwhelming, but our God is a God who is a God who can do wonders when his people pray. I'm going to preach on a passage from the Old Testament. So let's turn our Bibles to Genesis chapter 32 and turn to this section, which is a beautiful section. I'm sure all of us are familiar with this. That starts from verses 22 and runs through the end of the chapter. Genesis chapter 32, starting from verse 22 onwards. Allow me to read that for you as you follow that in your own Bibles. All right? That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him, and he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Interesting, isn't it? I don't know, when was the last time you ever visited this passage? It's been quite a while for me. And a couple of disclaimers before I actually venture into looking at what God has to speak to us. I didn't choose this passage because I'm a physiotherapist, okay? This seems like a rehabilitation passage with a hip dislocation and perhaps a need of some amount of rehabilitation for poor Jacob. But it's an interesting passage that I remember meditating on many, many, many years ago when I was much younger, right? And the passage starts like this, and for most of us who are familiar with the Old Testament, most of us who are familiar with the Genesis story will be familiar with the patriarchs, will be familiar with Jacob's story. I'll keep giving snippets as we go, but let's look at verse 22. So this is how it opens. It says, "That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok." Now, a couple of days back, I took my 1 wife and my 1 daughter, and I crossed from India to Sri Lanka, okay? Right? So, but for Jacob, the story seems interesting. He seems to be having 2 wives, and he has 2 maidservants or 2 female servants, which are his concubines, and his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of Jabbok. And now you can imagine what a task and an ordeal it must have been, right? So what's happening here, just to give you a little background, is now Jacob is coming back home after 20 long years. And all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with how Jacob started as a deceiver. Genesis chapter number 25, we don't have enough time to go and look at it in depth. That's where the story starts. This little baby, even while it was coming out of its mother, was grabbing the heel of the other child that came before him. Okay, and so they aptly named him deceiver, or in simple terms, cheater. I don't know if anybody in the congregation has the name Jacob, and if you do, I'm so sorry for speaking on this passage this evening. But the word Jacob meant here deceiver, because he was trying to hold his brother's heels and pull him back and come out first before his brother. Medically, it's very interesting. When there is fertilization happening, they say the first child that actually comes out is the child that is the embryo that was fertilized the last. So if there are two children, okay, if there are two embryos, okay, and one happens to come out, they say that the one that comes out by a few microseconds is younger than the one that comes second. Okay, but I don't want to go there and confuse us. What I want to say is, even when he started, he seemed to be starting on a bad note, and his parents named him cheater or supplanter or deceiver. So that's how his story goes, and every time his mom or dad would call him, okay, and if you knew the language, he would be hearing, cheater, come here, cheater, go there, cheater, sit here, cheater, do that, deceiver, do this, deceiver, don't do that. And what a bad name to have, right? But the story gets interesting as you keep on listening to what people have to say about you and what people have branded you. You somehow seem to morph into that character, and sure enough, later on, Jacob truly does something very vicious to his brother. And all of us are familiar with that. He steals his brother's birthright just for a bowl of lentil soup, okay? Just for a bowl of lentil soup, vegetarian soup. I wouldn't do that, right? Now, it's very interesting that after his mother had advised him to do that, it's a very funny family. Here we have a dad who likes one particular child, a mom who likes another child. Both of these children are twins. And the mother is scheming with the younger one and teaching the younger one how to deceive the father and how to grab the birthright from the older one. But the beauty is, the prophecy is playing out beautifully, and we will come to that if we have enough time to look into that, the sovereignty of God in all of this. But what's happening is, after having deceived his brother, Jacob is running for his life and goes and lands up in another place and meets another man who happens to be his uncle, but is 10 times far more worse than Jacob himself. Right? I don't know if any of you have had that experience. You know, you think you're street smart, and then you go and face bang on another guy who's 10 times more vicious and wicked than you. So our man is struggling under the clutches of his father-in-law for 20 long years. And he says enough is enough, and he wants to come back home. And that's where the story is set. That's where the story is set. So verse 22, that night Jacob got up and took the 2 wives, 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. Good enough. He at least knew that the people had to go first. The people are more important than possessions. He's sending the people first to safety, and then he's sending the possessions. Verse 24, now it is after this that something very important happens. So Jacob was left alone. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. And now that's very important for us saints. We need to observe what's happening here. Oftentimes our lives are so crowded with people. Our lives are so crowded with possessions. Our lives are so crowded with activities that there is really no time left for ourselves. There is no solitude. Solitude is supposed to be one of the spiritual disciplines. Very interesting that the Lord, or we will come to who that is waiting patiently for Jacob to be left alone. And when Jacob is alone, the man comes to wrestle. How many of you like to be alone? Introverts will like to be alone. Extroverts will not like to be alone. I'm an introvert, okay? And I am a professional extrovert, okay? If you give me a mic and a pulpit, I become an extrovert. But by myself, I'm an introvert, and I like to go alone and be by myself and reflect. But oftentimes, we are scared to be by ourselves and reflect, especially so if we are reflecting on spiritual matters, because we are afraid that in our moments of solitude, God will come and speak to us. Did you hear that? I said we are afraid that God will come and speak to us. Now all of us say, Lord, come and speak to me, come and speak to me, come and speak to me. I don't think we are really ready to hear what God wants to speak to us. Oftentimes we fill our lives with so much of clamor and din that we will drown the voice of God speaking to us. Because we know that when God speaks, then we need to respond. So here our man is almost trapped with his family gone ahead. The possessions have gone ahead. He has to cross a brook. And while he is there, he has an encounter. He has an encounter that would forever define his life. Now, this is not the first time Jacob is having an encounter. Jacob has, up until this point, had at least 3 miraculous supernatural encounters, and this is the 4th one. This is the 4th one. This is the defining one. And we will look at what is happening here. Let's look at verse number 25. 24 again. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. If you knew anything about wrestling, you will know that wrestling is one of the most intense sports that you can engage in. Wrestling is one of the most intense sports that you can engage in. Does anybody know how long a wrestling bout is? Last time I came here, I asked a similar question. How long is a wrestling bout? Olympic wrestling? Anybody watches wrestling? India has been winning a lot of medals in wrestling. That's why I'm bragging about it. A wrestling bout is just about 3 minutes. Okay? 3 minutes, which is 180 seconds. That's the typical time we stop at a traffic signal. Right? So by the time the red changes into green, one bout of wrestling is over, and there are only 3 bouts. And that defines whether you're a winner or a loser. That's modern day wrestling. 3 minutes because it is absolutely intense, and it is totally draining. And you don't have the capacity or the energy to wrestle anything more than that, and so the bell has to go ding at 3. And then you do 2 more bouts. And then your fate as a wrestler is decided. But wrestling in ancient times didn't have a clock that they went by. I don't know what rules they followed. But one thing I knew is that if your opponent pins you down and your back is on the floor, you are dead. You don't fight another wrestling match. That's how olden day wrestling went. So here what's happening is there is a wrestling bout that's happening. Imagine this guy. 2 wives, 2 female servants, 11 children, walking and crossing over, sending all his possessions, having the anxiety of visiting his brother. And at that moment, when he is alone, there's someone who comes and invites him for a wrestling bout. And being the fighter that he is, you know what Jacob is doing? He is wrestling and wrestling and wrestling and wrestling for hours on end till daybreak. Let's assume this match started at midnight till daybreak, at least till 4 or 5 or 6. For hours together, this bout is happening. And let's see what's happening after this. 25, when the man saw that he could not overpower him, that is Jacob's opponent, whoever that is, we'll come to that in a bit. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Now at this point, if you are a critical thinker, you should be crying foul, because when this man is unable to overpower Jacob, what is this man doing? This man is going and touching Jacob's hip and dislocating his hip, and thereby he wants to become a victor or a winner, or he wants to intimidate Jacob. But what is very important is we need to read closely here. It says, the opponent is just touching the socket of Jacob's hip. Now, if you had any idea of how the human hip is constructed, you will know that the hip joint is one of the most difficult joints to dislocate, because it's angulated like that, 45 degrees into a ball with a suction, multiple muscles around, and heavy ligaments holding it together. You just can't dislocate a human hip at all, humanly speaking. And the Bible is very beautiful, and we need to learn how to read between the lines and look for the details. This opponent is not snapping out Jacob's hip. This opponent is just touching Jacob's hip. Oftentimes, my daughter and I wrestle, okay? She likes to wrestle. She's only 5. She's, nearing 6. She likes to play all of these rough games, okay? And sometimes she wrestles well. And sometimes I call out to my wife and say, hey, look at this. She is almost winning. I'm almost losing. And she is all but this high, and she is all but 20 kilos in weight. So what's happening is a father is recognizing or realizing the limitedness of the strength of his daughter. And he is granting to that daughter a kind of a little victory. This passage needs to be understood like that. As we go deeper down, we will know who this person, this opponent is that Jacob is wrestling with. So what's happening? The opponent is touching the hip of Jacob. Jacob's hip snaps. Verse 26. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. So by now, what's happening is, if you will indulge me, can I have 2 volunteers? I want to demonstrate something if we have the time for it. 2 people who are daring to wrestle. Anyone? Can we have the father-son duo? Is that okay? Just for fun, huh? We won't give you any medals at the end of it. Please come here. Please come up front. Yes. So what you're supposed to do, Sunny, your name, I forgot your name. Ranuja. Ranujar. Ranjan. Okay, Ranjan. So Ranjan and his dad are going to wrestle, okay? So you know how the wrestling stance? You're supposed to hold like this. Can you come here and do that for us? Yeah? Yeah, so you lift your hands up, okay? And lock your hands like this. Try to push your dad and make him fall. Dad also push. Push, push, push as hard as you can, as hard as you can, as hard as you can, as hard as you can. This is a very good Christian dad. He's already going back. Push your son. Push, 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 push. Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. So as they are pushing, let's imagine that Ranjan's hip, okay, gets dislocated. That poor child will not be able to stand anymore because you need your legs to be the pillar of support to push. So imagine with a dislocated hip, you can't push. Then what would you do? You will naturally hang on your opponent. And that's what is happening here. You will hang on your opponent, and this opponent is saying, oh, this guy, I thought when I snap his hip, he will let go and I can go, but this guy is hanging on to me and he is not leaving me. And so he says, let me go, for it is daybreak. Jacob is literally hanging on to his opponent because his hip is broken, his strength is famished, but he just wouldn't let this guy go. Up until this point, he doesn't know who this guy is. Okay? But he's beginning to realize who this guy could be. Let's look at the next verse. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. I've heard a lot of prosperity preachers preach from this passage to claim blessings from God. In the morning service, during the time of prayer, Pastor mentioned something in the passing. Now, if we understand this term to be holding on to God and wrestling with God till we get our so-called blessings, okay, I think we are exegeting this passage wrong. What's happening here is a spiritual encounter of the greatest intensity that has never been captured in the Bible like this before. Here is an intense duel that is happening between a frail man and an opponent that seems equally strong, if not more, who has the power to just touch your opponent's hip and snap it out. You need about 180 kilogram force to snap a human hip out of its socket. You can't just touch and snap it. So what's happening here is there is an unfolding of who this opponent could be. And the blessing that Jacob is asking at this moment is not material blessing. How do we know that? Because he is already wealthy, he is already blessed, and he is already coming with all of his possessions and sending it batch after batch after batch after batch to just appease his brother. Familiarly and relationship wife, he has about 4 wives and 11 children. A cricket team. Right? So this doesn't add up as a prayer for a material blessing that sometimes we take this verse out of context. Jacob at this point is understanding an acute need in his soul for some kind of a repair that needs to be done, that has been eluding him for 20 years. Everything is beginning to come full circle. Everything is beginning to close in. There is an unfinished business that God seems to be about here at this encounter moment. That's what's happening. That's what's happening. And look at this. This is very interesting. Verse number 27. The man asked him, the opponent. The opponent is asking Jacob, what is your name? He's not asking it out of a lack of knowledge. He's not asking it for information. He is asking to really know if Jacob deserves a spiritual blessing or not. That's very interesting as to why he is using the very phrase, what is your name? Because this was a phrase that was used by Jacob's father many, many years ago. When the father's vision was gone and he could not distinguish between one son and the other, and he had to feel to see if this is the real son, Esau, to whom all the blessings should go. Jacob is faking it, and the father is asking, what is your name? And you know what Jacob says? Jacob says, I am Esau. 20 years ago, he said, I am Esau for the same question, and let's see what he says today. Today he says, my name is cheater. A new confession. For the very first time, he's had 3 encounters with God so far. Angelic encounters. Bethel, the house of God. 2 other encounters. This is the 4th one, and this is truly where he encounters God in full measure. Truly where he encounters God in full measure, because when God is asking this question, what is your name? He has grown enough in maturity and in vulnerability, and he has learnt his lessons, and he says, my name is cheater. My name is deceiver. I've been faking my identity. I've been trying to brush it under the carpet. I've been struggling with it. I've tried to create another identity with my possessions and people and relationships. But truly, heart of heart, I am a deceiver. And I'm struggling with the guilt of the deception that I played on my brother 20 years ago. That's what's happening. That's what's happening. Let's look at the next verse and see what the scriptures say. Verse 28. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob. Or in other words, the moment we confess our vulnerabilities to God, the moment we allow our facades to go away, the moment we say, God, I am tired of faking it. This is the real me. Here's the real deal. I am a deceiver. I'm someone who is weak. I'm someone who is failing. I'm someone who is faltering. And God, you know it all. You know it all, for you look at the heart of a man. And I'm tired of deceiving you. For I know, and I've come to learn, that I can deceive you no more. I am a deceiver. You know what God says? No, you're not a deceiver. You're not a deceiver anymore. The good news is I don't look at you as a deceiver anymore. All that I was waiting to do was for you to come to this moment of realization. And the moment you're there, it's done. You are not a deceiver. You are a clean slate all over again. And your name is Israel. Your name, you have been given a new name, and your name is that you are Israel, the one who contended with God, or a friend of God, the one who has seen the face of God. Your name is Israel. And this is the gospel message. This is the gospel message that we need to believe in. This is the gospel message that we need to preach to people. Here we have a God who comes back and helps us to realize us in our fallenness. And the moment we confess and acknowledge that, he is immediately waiting to forgive us of all our past and all our shame and all our darkness and all our weaknesses. And he will give you a new name, which is that you are a friend of God. You are a child of God. You are a son of the King. That's what's happening here. Now it gets even more interesting after this. The man said, your name will no longer be Jacob but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans, 20 years of struggle under Laban, and have overcome. 29, Jacob said, Jacob is playing a courtesy game here. He thought, oh, he asked my name, I told him my name. Now let me, for my turn, ask him his name. So he's saying, please tell me your name. The reply that God gives is absolutely astounding. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Oh, guy, did you not understand that I asked your name not because I didn't know it, but for you to realize and own up to it and confess it? And because you confessed it, today you have a new name, and you have no right to ask me what my name is, because there's nothing for me to confess. That's what God is saying. That's what God is saying. So why do you ask my name? This is not the same as Moses asking God, Lord, how shall I introduce you to Pharaoh? What would I say? Whose representative am I if he asked me? But this one is a courtesy game. Our man has not understood the depth of what's happening here fully yet. Okay, so then he's saying, why are you asking my name? And immediately after that, the beauty of our God is, then he blesses him there. He blesses him. He teaches him a lesson. He gives him a new name. He answers back appropriately for his foolish question, but still blesses him there. He blesses him. And this is the first time that our Jacob is truly getting blessed. And this blessing is not the name it and claim it blessing. This blessing is not the material blessing. This is a transformation of the soul. A soul that has been guilt-ridden for years together is meeting its Savior at Peniel and getting a new name and a new blessing that he'll hold on to forever. That he'll hold on to forever. Then verse number 30. So Jacob called the place Peniel. Jacob is a big name giver. He keeps on giving names to places, right? So he says, I'm going to give this place a name, and I'll call this place Peniel, which means it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The way it should read is, because I saw God face to face, that it is that my life was spared. Of course, we can't see God face to face because his glory is too bright for us to behold. But in another theological sense, just because he had this God encounter, his life is forever spared. His life is forever spared. 31, the sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Now this was a memory of the encounter that will stay with Jacob forever and ever. Every time Jacob would limp, Jacob would remember Peniel. Every time Jacob would remember Peniel, Jacob would remember the encounter. Every time Jacob remembers the encounter, Jacob will remember his confession. Every time Jacob remembers his confession, Jacob will remember the forgiveness and the new name. So he was a man who was physically robust and strong just before the Peniel experience, but was spiritually guilt-laden and broken. But what's happening is there's a reversal of things. He's going back limping, physically weak, but spiritually at his best yet. And that's the kind of God that we serve. And that's the kind of encounters that each of us, I'm sure, has had with God. But my question is, sometimes it is possible for us to get too familiar with our God. That God will lose the awe that we need to have for him, and he will become like a next door neighbor. He will become like a celestial Santa Claus. He will become someone that we are too casual with or casual about. The beauty of Jacob limping is that is forever a memory of this encounter. But if we don't have anything to hold on to those memories, dear people, we can sometimes forget our encounters with God. Now, my challenge to all of us is, if at some point in time we've had an encounter with God, is the memory of that encounter and the gratitude towards that encounter still fresh in our hearts and minds. And oftentimes we are historical Christians who can say, 20 years ago I did that, and 20 years ago I did that. Very good, but why not now? We can't live in our past histories and past glories. We can continue to have encounters on a regular basis. And we need to crave to have encounters on a regular basis. And we need to make provisions to be in solitude with our God and not be afraid to listen to what he has to speak to us, lest we should change our lives. So we have a God who is a God of graciousness. He's not out there coming behind your back to humiliate you, but to help you get to the point of confessing to him. And the moment we do that, he gives us a new name. He gives us a new life. He gives us a new identity. So I don't know why God asked me to prepare this message and preach this message. After I went from the morning English service, I immediately had to sit before my lunch and finish this. This is not my prepared sermon for this evening. I don't know. And I don't like to preach sermons like this, especially when you're an itinerant. You like to make friends with people and teach friendly sermons and, get invited back again, Everybody is happy. But these are sermons that pierce us. These are sermons that shake us up. These are sermons that could possibly hurt some of us. I don't know. But I'm just doing it in obedience. Perhaps there is someone who needs to have a fresh encounter with God. Perhaps there is some unfinished business that some of us has that God wants to bring full circle and finish. Perhaps there are relationships that need to be mended. Perhaps there are things that we need to expose to God and say, God, come and meet me and let me have a perennial moment with you. I don't know, dear people. I am as much in need of an encounter with God every day like all of us are. And my humble prayer is that we will always continue to have encounters with God. And that will shape our lives, that will shape our communities, that will shape the gospel of Jesus in your land and in mine.